Now we want to show a different view when a user presses a row. We want this different view to be displayed, but still allow us to go back to the list view afterwards. Before we can do that though, we need to show the feed in a Navigator component. In our app container component, which we created when we introduced the tabs in an earlier module, we referenced the Navigator iOS component. In the feed tab, we removed the reference to the feed component. We pull in a Navigator iOS in here. Let's set some style on it to ensure that it's a flexbox. To tell it to display the feed component, we use the initial root property, which takes an object for configuration. On this object, we use the component attribute to specify that we want the feed component to display, with the title of, you guessed it, feed. Let's duplicate this feed.js file and use it as a starting point for the component we want to display when the user presses a row. I save this file and call it push payload. Let's switch these tabs around. Okay, we remove the components we don't need over here. We change the component's name to match the file name, push payload. We remove the state variable we don't need, these functions we don't need, including press row and render row. We clean out the render function and set it up to return a new view. We want to return a view from here and we want some style on it. We want it to act as a flexbox so that we can control the layout of its children elements. We add some padding on the top to accommodate the additional space needed by the navigation bar. We use the justify content rule to lay out our children from the top down. Now I'm using the align items attribute to get the item's horizontal alignment to be in the center. Close that off. In here I just add a simple text element to test that everything is working up to this point. But how does the app know to display this view when the user presses the row? To do that, we need to go back to the feed component, and here in the press row function, we get a reference to the navigator on the props object. Because we set the navigator up with the feed component earlier, the navigator ensured that the feed component is constructed with a reference to itself, specifically to allow this component to tell the navigator to show a different view. To do this, we call the push function on the navigator, which expects exactly the same configuration object we used earlier when we chose to show the feed component by setting the initial root property. This time we set a title of push event and a component of push payload. What's different this time though is we want to pass some data to the component, so we add a pass props attribute, which takes another object. In here we specify a push event attribute and set it to the row data that was passed in here when the row was pressed. When you set the pass props attribute, your component will receive the values you pass in here on its constructor. And because we reference the push payload here, we need to require it here at the top with our other requires. Cool, that worked. There's the new view with the new label, the text message. And as you can see, we have a way to go back to the feed list.